Welcome to Should Have Known It, where we present 15-minute videos of things you definitely should have known. Hi, welcome to Shoulda Known It. I'm Miss Aoki, and today's topic is the curse of knowledge. Newton's setup sounds almost too simple to be illuminating. You assign people to one of two roles, tapper or listener. The tapper picks a song from a list of 25 well-known tunes, then taps out the rhythm on a table with their finger. No humming, no singing. Just the rhythm. The listener's job is to name the song. 120 tappers ran through this. They tapped 120 songs total, and listeners correctly identified 3 of them. 3 out of 120. Meanwhile, before the guessing happened, the tappers had estimated that about half their listeners would get it. That's a 50% prediction against a 2.5% reality. Here's why the gap is so wide. When a tapper is tapping Happy Birthday, they are hearing the song in their head. Every note, every word, the melody filling the silence. The listener hears none of that. The listener hears a series of arrhythmic knocks on a flat surface. The tapper cannot turn off the song in their head. They literally cannot hear what the listener is hearing. And that inability, that's the mechanism. Newton called this the curse of knowledge. Once you know a thing, you cannot fully simulate what it's like not to know it. Your knowledge of the song doesn't just help you, it actively corrupts your ability to predict how hard it is to communicate. The curse isn't ignorance, the curse is expertise. Think about what it would take to actually unknow something. Not just forget it temporarily. Really experience the world the way someone does who has never encountered it. You can't. When you read the word apple, you don't see 7 letters. You get flavor, color, a childhood memory, a fruit bowl, maybe a logo. That semantic layer fires instantly, and you have no way to suppress it. That's not a weakness. That's what reading is, but it means you're permanently altered by learning. Psychologists call this an availability bias in reverse. Normally, when something is easy for you to retrieve, you assume it's easy for everyone. The tapper is retrieving the song effortlessly. It's playing in their head, and they project that ease onto the listener. The listener has no retrieval pathway at all. There's an asymmetry that feels invisible from the inside. And here's the part that should make every expert uncomfortable. The better you know something, the worse this gets. A novice explaining a topic has just learned it. They remember the confusion. They remember the moment they got it wrong. An expert has forgotten all of that. The pathway has been smoothed so many times that they can no longer feel the bumps that once tripped them up. Chip and Dan Heath, in their 2007 book Made to Stick, used Newton's tapping experiment as the opening frame for a much larger argument that the biggest enemy of clear communication isn't laziness or lack of effort. It's knowledge itself. The more you know, the harder it becomes to explain. Not because you're arrogant, though, that doesn't help, but because your brain has genuinely lost access to what it felt like to not know. Let's make this concrete. Alan Greenspan chaired the Federal Reserve for nearly 19 years and was legendary for testimony that nobody could parse. Senate committees would finish his appearances more confused than when they started. He wasn't being evasive. By all accounts, he genuinely believed he was being clear. He had spent so long inside the model that the model's assumptions felt like plain English. The same thing happens in medicine. A 2007 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that when doctors were asked to estimate how long a diagnosis would take to explain to a patient, they consistently underestimated it by about 40%. And when patients were tested for comprehension after those appointments, the gap between what doctors thought they'd communicated and what patients retained averaged around 50%. The tapping experiment, but with discharge instructions. Software documentation is another graveyard of this bias. The person writing the documentation knows every assumption the software makes, and so they never write those assumptions down. They document what to do, but not why a step might fail, or what a new user might confuse for a similar thing that does something different. Stack Overflow exists largely because documentation authors couldn't feel their own knowledge anymore. Here's what I find genuinely astonishing about this bias. It gets worse as the stakes get higher. In fields with life or death communication, medicine, aviation, nuclear operations, the experts have usually spent the most time acquiring specialized knowledge, which means they are the most cursed. Aviation solved this partly with checklists and read-back protocols because they recognize that experts cannot be trusted to intuitively gauge what needs to be said out loud. The curse is structural. It doesn't respond to trying harder. This is why so many startups fail to explain what they actually do. The founder has lived inside the problem for 2 years. Every assumption is so deeply embedded that it doesn't register as an assumption anymore. They'll write a pitch that says, "We're a B2B SaaS platform for asynchronous cross functional alignment." To them, that's a precise description. To a Series A investor hearing it cold, it says nothing at all. Paul Graham has written about this. He calls it the schlep blindness problem adjacent. Founders become blind to the friction that outsiders feel because their own familiarity has converted friction into invisible background. But the curse of knowledge version is subtler than schlep blindness. It's not that you don't see the problem, it's that you can't feel the distance between where you are and where your audience starts. There's a related phenomenon in teaching called expert blind spot, identified by researchers Nathaniel Gage and David Berliner in the 1970s and extended by Carnegie Mellon researcher Mitchell Nathan. Experts systematically predict that the hardest parts of a subject for beginners will be the conceptually complex parts. The elegant theory, the tricky edge case. But beginners are often tripped up by something far more basic that the experts stopped noticing years ago. The expert blind spot is the curse of knowledge applied to pedagogy. Nathan's studies on math teachers showed something remarkable. He asked math professors to rank the difficulty of algebra problems as they expected students to experience them. The professors ranked symbolic problems, the abstract notation, as easier than word problems. Students found the opposite. The professors had spent so much time in symbolic notation that they'd forgotten it was a foreign language. To them, solve for X felt approachable to a new student. The letter itself was the obstacle. Most of the time, the curse of knowledge doesn't announce itself, it shows up as impatience. You explained it already. Why don't they understand? It shows up as bad slide decks where every bullet assumes 3 levels of prior knowledge the audience doesn't have. It shows up as a meeting where the senior person thinks the decision is obvious and can't understand why there's any debate. It shows up as a user manual that nobody reads and instructions that tell you what to do without telling you why. It also shows up in feedback. If you've ever written something, handed it to an editor, and been baffled by which parts confused them, the curse of knowledge is the explanation. You knew what you meant when you wrote it, so you literally could not see that the page didn't carry that meaning. The text seemed complete to you because your head was filling in the gaps automatically. Here is something counterintuitive. Reading your own work aloud does help, but not because hearing it is magic. It helps because speaking forces you to slow down and process each word, which briefly disrupts the automatic gap filling. The same mechanism explains why rubber duck debugging works in programming. Explaining a problem to an inanimate object forces you to externalize the assumptions you'd otherwise skip. The duck doesn't fix anything. You do. Because the curse temporarily lifts when you have to serialize your knowledge for an audience, even an imaginary one. The technical version of this problem in communication theory is called common ground deficit. In 1986, Herbert Clark and Susan Brennan formalized the idea that all successful communication depends on both parties sharing a common ground, a set of mutual beliefs and context. The curse of knowledge makes you overestimate the size of that common ground. You think you share more with your listener than you do, and you pitch your explanation from that imagined common ground instead of the real one. So, how do you actually catch yourself doing this? The honest answer is that you mostly can't in real time. But there are some structural interventions that work. One is the stranger test, a method Chip Heath uses in business school. Hand your document to someone who has never heard of the project and set a timer for 5 minutes. At any point where they slow down, reread, or furrow their brow is a point where your knowledge wasn't getting through. Another is what researchers call perspective-taking interviews before you finalize any communication. You explicitly interview someone at the level of your intended audience and listen for what they don't understand, not what they get wrong, what they don't understand. The missing knowledge is usually different from the wrong knowledge, and only the first kind is your failure as a communicator. There's also the reconstruction test, which I find surprisingly useful. After you explain something, ask the listener to explain it back, not to you, but to a hypothetical third person who wasn't in the room. What they leave out, what they reconstruct incorrectly, and what order they put things in tells you exactly where your explanation failed. The tapper effect is reversed. Now you're the listener and you can hear the gaps. What doesn't work? Just trying to remember what it was like to not know. This is the instinctive fix, and it basically doesn't function. You can access the memory of not knowing, but you can't re-experience the cognitive state. It's like trying to taste food by remembering tasting it. The memory is there, but the information you need, the felt sense of not knowing, has been overwritten. This is why veteran teachers who say, remember, think back to when you first learned this, are giving advice that's much harder to follow than it sounds. One thing that makes this bias tricky to counter is that it only runs in one direction. A person who doesn't know something can accurately imagine what it would be like to know it, more or less. They can say, when I learn this, I'll be able to do X. But a person who already knows something cannot accurately imagine not knowing it. The curse flows from knowledge to ignorance, not from ignorance to knowledge. This asymmetry has real consequences for how we design instruction, products, and organizations. It means that experts are reliable neither at predicting how hard their subject is to learn, nor at estimating how much time beginners will need, nor at knowing which parts of an explanation to expand. Every one of those estimates requires the reverse journey, from knowledge back to ignorance, and that journey isn't available. It also means the most experienced voice in the room is the least reliable narrator of their own field's accessibility. The Nobel laureate's lecture is, on average, harder to follow than the PhD student's lecture, which is harder to follow than the undergraduate TA's explanation. This isn't because credentials make people bad communicators. It's because each layer of expertise adds more that gets compressed into assumed background. The undergraduate TA just learned this. The Nobel laureate learned it so long ago that the learning itself has been archived. And here's the corrective implication that most people miss. The solution isn't to dumb things down. Dumbing down is what you do when you don't understand the audience. The solution is to trace the actual path, the specific concepts in the specific order that get a person from their current state to your current state. That path exists, you walked it once. The curse doesn't erase the path, it just stops you from seeing it. Your job is to reconstruct it, not to build a shorter, blurrier version. This is the part that the Heath brothers make central in Made to Stick, and that I want to leave you with. Just knowing the name, the curse of knowledge, is itself a cognitive tool. Once you name a bias, you can start to spot it. You can say in a meeting, I think we might be hitting the curse of knowledge here. Can someone outside this project read this before we send it? That sentence, said out loud, reroutes the conversation. Labels are powerful because they're shared. Before curse of knowledge existed as a phrase, you'd have to describe the phenomenon every time you wanted to talk about it, and most people wouldn't be sure what you meant. Now you can say it in a meeting and people recognize it. The Dunning-Kruger effect works the same way. The phenomenon existed before David Dunning and Justin Kruger named it in 1999, but naming it gave people a handle for a thing they'd been watching happen and couldn't easily describe. The map doesn't just name the territory. The map helps you navigate. There's also a humility dimension worth sitting with. The curse of knowledge, once you really internalize it, should make you more patient with people who don't understand what you're saying. The failure mode, the part where someone you've explained something to still doesn't get it, is often less about their comprehension and more about your invisible assumptions. The question to ask isn't, why don't they understand? It's, what am I not saying that I think I'm saying? I think the most generous thing an expert can do is try. Really try to reverse engineer their own knowledge into a path that someone else can walk, not because accuracy requires it, not because it's professionally expected, but because the thing you know might actually matter to the person you're trying to reach, and they deserve to receive it in a form they can use. The curse is real, but so is the possibility of overcoming it. So when you finish watching this, here's the practical thing I want to ask you to do. The next time you're frustrated that an explanation you gave didn't land, before you decide it's because the listener wasn't paying attention, or isn't smart enough, or didn't try hard enough, run the tapping experiment in your head. You had the song, they heard knocks. That's not their fault. That's the shape of knowledge transfer, and it's your problem to solve, not theirs. Newton's tappers couldn't believe only 2.5% of their songs were identified. They were sure their listeners were failing. In almost every case, they weren't. The listeners were doing exactly what was possible, given what they could hear. The tappers were just so deep inside the music that they'd forgotten what silence sounded like. Don't be the tapper. Learn to hear the knocks. That's everything. See you next time. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me and learning something new. Until next time, click like and subscribe.